everyone, Benjamin Siegel here, and welcome back to this introduction to India and South Asia. Today, after spending some time beyond the boundaries of the Republic of India in Pakistan and later Pakistan and Bangladesh, we're going to return to the transformations to economic life and politics in the Republic of India after 1947. We're going to examine in greater depth how India worked after independence to overcome some of the biggest pressing economic and social concerns that the nation's leadership had promised to resolve, some successfully and others less so. As we move forward, we're going to be dividing post-colonial Indian history into three different eras, trying to understand how India's leaders have conceptualized poverty and development and have sought to ameliorate them in each period. First, we're going to look at the era of high planning under Jawaharlal Nehru, as India tried to braid together the ideas of planned economic development and popular democracy. We're going to look at a transformative second era that happened afterwards, when Nehru's daughter, Indra Gandhi, sought to use authoritarian methods to galvanize or push forward economic development, using the language of poverty and development somewhat instrumentally. And this will connect a little bit with the authoritarian impulse that we talked about in the context of Pakistan and Bangladesh. And finally, we're going to look at a different third period in the 1980s and 1990s, when global understandings of economic development began to change, and how under Rajiv Gandhi and then Manmohan Singh, India sought to relax restrictions on its economy, promoting certain free market ideas, with a mix of positive and negative consequences for both growth and equality. For outsiders looking at India, there's always been a little bit of a tension in how India has appeared. On the one hand, travelers have always associated India with great wealth. Think back to Vasco da Gama and the rumors of riches that brought Europeans and others to India in the first place. But there's also the belief that India's poverty is an endemic feature of the landscape itself. We can see this, of course, in early travel writings and colonial depictions of suffering and more contemporary images, things like the concert for Bangladesh or Slumdog Millionaire, or that saying that was all too common maybe 20 years ago of finish your plate, there's starving children in India. By independence, though, even Indians were beginning to perceive India as a place that was fundamentally characterized by its poverty, thanks in part to a generation of Indian economic nationalists. You'll of course remember Dadabhai Naoroji and his drain of wealth theory that he expressed in the book Poverty and Un-British Rule as early as 1901. There was that idea, if you think back to it, that Britain had drained India's riches to Europe in the form of agricultural produce and mineral wealth, and had left nothing but poverty in its wake. And this was an idea that was very influential upon generations of Indians, particularly in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So as soon as India's nationalists, and the Congress leadership in particular, came to see that independence was on the horizon, they began thinking through the thorny questions of how poverty should be alleviated after the British left. A decade before independence, in 1938, the Congress Party created a National Planning Committee to consider some of the options available to them. Of course, the idea of national planning was a major international paradigm at the time, thanks to the Soviet Union. If you look back to Russia, as early as 1921, there was a state planning committee that was established there. By the time independence finally came to India in 1947, it was deeply clear to the national leadership that India's poverty was the greatest problem facing the new nation. This was clear in that famous Tryst with Destiny speech, when Jawaharlal Nehru claimed that independence wouldn't mean anything by itself, but rather it was an opening of opportunity to the great triumph and achievements that await us. And standing in the way of those achievements was India's hope of ending poverty and ignorance and disease and inequality of opportunity. This was just a massive task, and while it's somewhat hard to quantify the levels of poverty in India at independence, historians and economists have come toward some figures that might help us get a sense of what India was actually facing. By the best calculations, in 1947, there was only about half a kilogram of food available per person per day. The literacy rate in India was 17% among those over the age of 10, life expectancy at birth was only 32.5 years, and the crop yields, industrial productivity, and levels of human capital formation were as low in India as anywhere else in Asia, and probably as low as anywhere else in the entire world. And then there was that question of population. India's population was soaring. It was around 345 million people at independence, and it was growing very quickly. So quickly, in fact, that planners rarely talked about social problems without tying them to questions of population growth. Indian nationalists argued that these figures of independence represented a decline during colonial rule. And economists debate how much this was actually the case, but it seems that in a very general sense it was indeed true. A little while back we spoke about Nehru's formative influences, namely the influence of the Soviet Union, and more broadly the idea that centralized government was necessary to help lift a nation out of poverty. Nehru was careful in that he rarely called himself a socialist in public, but in private he absolutely was. And in public from the mid-1930s onward, he declared that India's ultimate goal was the establishment of what he called a socialist pattern of society. He did have allies. There was the left wing of the Congress Party, and they agreed with Nehru that only state-led development, with curtailed role for private industry and industrialists, was going to help India grow into a major industrial power. India's leading businessmen actually went along with these schemes, in part because capitalists were asked to play big roles in ushering in India's industrialization. Broadly, Indian industrialists were families which had done very well under British rule, and they had lent their support to Congress as its victory had seemed more and more inevitable. But you can already see the tension at work. There was a socialist pattern society, which meant that no one was really supposed to get too far ahead of anyone else. But then also there were hopes of growth. And that set up this dynamic that continues to be important to this day. The tension between growth for growth alone and growth paired with equality. This is something that Indian planners have always tried to resolve and have never gotten quite right. So how was India supposed to actualize this socialist pattern of development? The country was poor, and maybe even more important than its poverty, it had very little in the way of foreign currency reserves, money that it was keeping in either dollars or pounds. So it came up with a couple of strategies that worked together to try to industrialize and develop India on the cheap. The establishment of the 5-year plans, policies of what were called import substitution, and then a scheme called community development. We'll take these one by one. First, beginning in 1950, there was the establishment of India's 5-year plans. In the middle of the 20th century, the world was planning crazy. The Soviet Union had a plan, China had a plan, and India was going to have a plan too. Every plan would spell out the targets for industrial and agricultural growth in the country and plan out each sector in detail. The idea was that over time an industrial economy would be created that would prioritize heavy industry, things like iron or steel, over consumer goods. There were some successes to these plans. In the first plan, agriculture grew a great deal, and also in the second. Industrial input grew by about 7% each year into the 1960s, and India's national income grew by about 4% each year. That would have been good, but the number was effectively halved when you took into account population growth. Secondly, India embraced what a lot of other developing countries or countries of the global south were embracing in a policy of import substitution industrialization. The idea was that it was a bad idea to import things from abroad, and that foreign imports should be aggressively replaced by domestic production, sponsored by the state. The state would lead economic development through nationalization. They would subsidize vital industries, increase taxes, and give really protectionist trade policies. So India could save its really limited amounts of foreign currency reserves for the things that it just simply couldn't make at home. The problem was this insistence on self-sufficiency in everything drove up a lot of consumer prices. And it meant that India had a lot of consumer goods that no one really wanted, like the Hindustan Ambassador, which was an attractive car but which had a design that stayed the same for half a century. Thirdly, there was a third set of schemes broadly called community development and Panchayat Raj. Nehru's government wanted to have local development schemes that would make big impacts without spending a lot of money. The most important project of that type was community development. Under the project of community development, India was divided up and its villages were put into development blocks. And in each one of these blocks, the government would place trained village-level workers who were able to advise farmers or craftsmen. This was a policy that was heavily influenced by, and in fact was promoted by, American development aid. This was a policy that was influenced by and actively promulgated by American developmental experts. It seemed to Americans that investing in this scheme of community development was a way of promoting local development that didn't leave villagers susceptible to ideologies like communism or socialism, which were growing elsewhere in Asia and around the world. And it gave something of a Gandhian feel to state development projects, in a state which had more or less ignored Gandhian visions in favor of massive, state-driven industrialization. These projects were actually somewhat successful. They blended together the existing interests of village elites, and they made them important intermediaries between rural citizens who were sometimes otherwise invisible and the state itself. In some ways, all of these projects and schemes worked together to help India create a small but growing industrial base, and it helped make government structures more robust. But in terms of growth, it just wasn't as successful as planners had hoped for. That 4% growth that I talked about earlier, and that was half with population growth, was a pretty bad rate by international standards. And foreign economists came up with a derogatory term for this growth. They called it the Hindu rate of growth. And the word Hindu called back colonial ideals, and offensive ones, that implied an outlook of fatalism or contentedness. Foreign economists believed that Indians basically just didn't want to work. From another perspective, these policies also thwarted private business. It was pretty impossible to open a business without a whole range of permits, so much so that people started characterizing the new state as a license Raj. And maybe most importantly, the new state's policies didn't do much to combat poverty, illiteracy, or disease. Development planners were sometimes starry-eyed. They were obsessed with numbers. But they often forgot the values that inspired the project of development itself. And there were big failures in early independent India to better nutrition, to get rid of hunger, and to provide entitlements to basic health and education. This is something that India has struggled with in the 20th century, even as China has done comparatively much better. But it's worth mentioning that Indians themselves didn't always glom onto these state visions. And there's two important movements which are worth mentioning briefly here. The first came early, in 1951, with what came to be known as the Bhutan or the Sarvodaya Movement. This movement started with a man named Vinoba Bhave, who was an associate and a trainee of Gandhi. He was a religious figure whom many people saw as the spiritual successor of Mahatma Gandhi. And from his ashram in India's west, Bhave walked across the country to a southern village where there was a battle raging between landless peasants and their landlords. The landless peasants were threatening to join the Communist Party, and Vinoba Bhave convinced high-caste zamindars to give the landless peasants some land instead. This turned into a big national movement, which suggested that wealthy or high-caste citizens should donate land, food, and labor without intervention by the state. This wasn't a very effective movement, and it didn't last long, but it was deeply popular. It seemed like the last remaining vestige of Gandhian ideology in Nehruvian India. The other challenge to state visions came in 1959, when a group of Congress representatives, disgruntled with the left-leaning policies of the party, broke away dramatically with it. Nehru had passed a resolution calling for the implementation of cooperative farming in India. This was something that was to be done in India along basically the same lines as was being done in the Soviet Union or China. For anyone who believed in the free market or the rights of peasants to cultivate their own land, this was an affront to basic ideas of liberty. So those factions broke away from the Congress Party to form the Swatantra or Freedom Party, which valued growth over equality. This party wasn't very effective or long-lived, but it represented an economic ideology that had been maligned by the early state and would continue to grow more and more important in later generations of Indian politics. Each one of these movements were able to gain traction by claiming that they represented the institutional continuity of Gandhi's economic thought, at a moment when Nehru seemed like he had deviated completely from it. Let's move on to that second era in thinking about poverty in post-colonial India. There was a new era in the public rhetoric around India's poverty that came up under the prime ministership of Indra Gandhi. Indra Gandhi was Nehru's daughter and his only child. She had served as something of an official hostess for her father, and she'd been Minister of Information and Broadcasting under the next short-lived Prime Minister, Lal Bahadur Shastri. By 1966, she had been widowed, she was the mother of 2 sons, and she soon emerged as the Iron Woman of Indian politics. Indra Gandhi rooted her career in 2 ideas. She sensed very accurately that populist rhetoric about poverty would help shore up democratic support in the country. But she also had an authoritarian side, and she worked very effectively to consolidate party and personal power. Indra Gandhi's earliest years in power saw her committing to reform India's struggling agriculture. In 1965, India's monsoon failed, and the country was hit by a drought. Food production declined close to 20% in a single year. There were grain shipments coming from the United States, and they helped stave off disaster. But industrial and agricultural growth had stopped, and it was clear that India needed a new strategy. Indra Gandhi turned at this moment to a new agricultural strategy that had been pioneered experimentally by the American Ford and Rockefeller Foundations. Part of it was technological. It concentrated things like fertilizers, seeds, irrigation, and credit in the hands of a few farmers. Part of it was also tied to economic reforms, where India bowed to American pressure to devalue the rupee. Under Nehru, this kind of change wouldn't have been possible. It would have been unthinkable to give new technologies to some farmers but not give it to others. It would represent growth without equality. But Indra Gandhi was willing to concentrate resources if it seemed like that would result in growth. So the government distributed high-yielding varieties of seeds developed in Mexico and the Philippines, which required the use of chemical fertilizers and enhanced irrigation. The idea was again to bring all of these inputs together in one place, avoiding the pitfalls of the earlier plans that had just tried to give something to everyone. The result came to be known as the Green Revolution. In the 1967-68 harvest, Indian agricultural production leapt ahead by 26%. Population was growing, still at around 2% a year, but India finally seemed like it was making progress towards feeding itself. There were problems evident, though, from the first day. First, the growth rate that was there at the beginning didn't last. Those rates were dependent on heavy monsoons, and they didn't rise for 5 years after 1970. And maybe worse, inequality also began to grow. Wheat-growing areas did better than rice-growing areas, and farmers that had been well off in the beginning just did better afterwards. The new strategy seemed to work basically very well on large land holdings, so it was wealthy farmers who were already connected and entrepreneurial who gained the most out of the Green Revolution. India's poorer farmers, even if they were marginally better off, found themselves comparatively much further behind. This was actually the beginning of an unsettling dynamic in the late 1960s and 70s. Inequality was continuing to grow. Indra Gandhi was able to build her political career on a sense of deprivation among the underprivileged, but in fact it was her policies that was exacerbating it. often seemed to be exacerbating it. In the 1967 elections, the Congress Party lost a great number of seats. This seemed to be the beginning of the end for a powerful organization that Gandhi had helped build and Nehru had nurtured into a post-colonial political dynamo. Indra Gandhi took this moment to break away from the Congress. She formed her own party called the Congress I. But during her administration with Congress I, India's economic growth continued to stagnate, and there was growing unrest and inequality. Strangely, for a sitting prime minister, Indra Gandhi tried to place herself at the head of a populist uprising. She abandoned efforts to work through the Congress bureaucracy, and instead she appealed to the people over the heads of the country's elected politicians. She came up with a new slogan, Garibi Hatao, or End Poverty, and she used this slogan to build up support. She won a large new popular mandate, and she continued to move leftward in her stated policies. She pushed through an amendment that restricted the right to hold property. She nationalized India's insurance companies and coal mines, and as we discussed last time, she fought the 1971 war with Pakistan over Bangladesh's independence. This might have been fine, but the problem was none of it really helped reduce poverty. These measures were basically just symbolic, or they only skirted the edge of real reform. Indra Gandhi couldn't really afford to antagonize the rural wealthy, and she couldn't combat things like tax evasion among the urban elites. Effectively, she was trapped between the conflicting goals of economic growth and social justice, and things ground to a standstill. This dynamic proved to be unsustainable, and ultimately it would be Indra Gandhi's political undoing. Indra Gandhi lost the support of many of her old Congress allies, including many of her father's peers. She had upset an old friend of her father, Jayaprakash Narayan, who was an independence hero and who had renounced political office to serve the poor directly. JP, as he was best known to the Indian public, began mobilizing supporters in his home state of Bihar in early 1974, and soon he called for total revolution to force the government to enact real pro-poor policies. Shortly afterwards, an Indian high court declared that Indra Gandhi's election in 1971 had been corrupt and invalid. And rather than resign, Indra Gandhi declared a state of emergency. If we go back, we'll remember that in the 1935 Government of India Act, renewed as the Indian Constitution, the head of a state or the federal government could dismiss elected officials underneath him or her in the time of an emergency. This had been used before at the state level, but never at the federal level. And the Indian emergency was the most dire challenge to democracy that the country had ever faced. All civil liberties were suspended, the press was censored, opposition parties were banned, political opponents were thrown in jail, and elections were postponed again and again. Many middle-class Indians surprisingly supported the emergency. The alternative had been framed as either anarchy or total standstill. The emergency regime called for citizens to push India forward independently, instilling in them a commitment to discipline and hard work. It looked a little bit like Italian fascism in the 1930s. Some of these measures worked. Office workers showed up on time, tax evasion fell, there was an enforced labor peace, and it helped drive up industrial growth. But while Indra Gandhi claimed that the emergency represented a direct assault on poverty, there were no new policies that really helped that goal. And the language of poverty alleviation was sometimes used to enact really grim, dark policies. Indra Gandhi put her son, Sanjay Gandhi, in charge of a number of social schemes. He cleared slums, and worse, he undertook a campaign of forced sterilization in those slums. He'd drag off the poor, sterilize them against their will. This would set back the cause of family planning in India for many decades to come. The emergency lasted until 1975. Indra Gandhi lost power and then came back again. She would ultimately be assassinated by her bodyguards, and we're going to talk about that next time. But what's important for us to remember is that Indra Gandhi, instead of alleviating poverty, had simply used the language of poverty to bring about authoritarianism. The biggest consequence of this era was a real strong distrust in the state's ability to solve the problem of poverty. That brings us to a third period in India's economic history. After the emergency, many Indians were deeply distrustful of the state and wanted something new, even if that something new came from a familiar place. Indra's son, Rajiv Gandhi, won a big mandate after his mother's death. He won the biggest mandate that the Congress Party had ever enjoyed to that point. But Rajiv Gandhi was a little bit different. He was ready to break with the Congress system by slowly opening up India to world capitalism, and he began to preach the virtues of private enterprise. By the 1980s, India had basically been walled off from the global economy. Many industrialists in India found that this was just fine. There were bureaucrats and bad manufacturers who had captive markets and a lot of opportunity for corruption or graft. Politicians, whether they came from the right or the left, were very happy to keep India free of American culture and goods. And there was broad public suspicion dating from colonial times of all sorts of capitalists. But Rajiv Gandhi came from a different world. He had been educated at Cambridge, he worked as a pilot for Indian Airlines, and had married an Italian waitress named Sonia, who would later become one of India's most important politicians. While overseas, Rajiv Gandhi had become aware of a new world of capital and computers, and most of his friends were managers. He felt very constrained by the system he was returning to back in India. Under his administration, regulation on the sizes of firms was lifted. Taxes on wealth and inheritance were reduced, and licenses on producing consumer goods and high-tech products were lifted. One of the biggest consequences of all this was the transformation of a sleepy town in India named Bangalore into the computer capital of India. It was powered by something called business process outsourcing, or just outsourcing, where IT work was done overseas in India where the cost of labor was cheap. This was the beginning of India's famous service industry. There was a lot of opposition to these policies, and a lot of corruption too, but the door seemed like it was opening a crack. There were dangers to this as well. The price of dismantling regulations became very evident in the Bhopal Union Carbide disaster, which took place in December 1984. In the middle of the night, a leak from a pesticide plant operated by an American company spread toxic gas through the neighborhood near the plant that was inhabited mostly by poor workers. 7,000 Indians died instantly from breathing that toxic gas, and many thousands more died in the weeks that followed. Numerous lawsuits were brought against the Union Carbide Company, and it eventually agreed to an out-of-court settlement of $470 million. But most victims got no compensation, and no criminal charges were ever filed. It was very possible in 1984 to see that economic liberalization had both promise and peril. We'll return next time to the early 1990s in India, which was a time characterized by crisis. There were massive mobilizations against Muslims in India, the rise of a new right wing that threatened the project of democratic India again, but there was also a worsening economic crisis in India. Controls, subsidies, and enterprises were all clashing against one another, and the economy was in shambles. The government had a big fiscal deficit, and it doubled over the last decade, and India was plummeting in its ranking among industrial nations. In 1991, India was facing staggering annual debt payments, completely depleted foreign exchange reserves, and a credit rating so low that it was forced to put up gold to get foreign loans. Then there was one major other crisis. In 1991, the Soviet Union fell, and it meant that India had finally lost its biggest patron. So out of desperation, India at this moment turned to the International Monetary Fund, or the IMF, and it agreed to the structural adjustments that would make India more market-oriented and eligible for new loans. The finance minister at this time was Dr. Manmohan Singh, a very smart economist who was put in charge of India's economic reforms, and he committed India to a range of changes for which it received a $1.5 billion loan. The rupee was devalued by around 20%, it was made convertible into foreign currency, subsidies were abolished, tariffs were lowered, public sector industries were reduced, most licenses ended, and a stock exchange was launched. And in the first 3 years of these reforms, India broke free of that Hindu rate of growth. The annual rate of growth hit 7%. Lots of industries grew, but one did very well in particular, that of software development. Bangalore became the new Indian Silicon Valley, and some of this was powered by returning non-resident Indians who had gone to the United States, founded companies like Sun Microsystems and Hotmail, and then were returning to India to build a tech base there. Not everyone was happy. The Hindu right, the socialist left were all upset by the end of the era of self-sufficiency. They argued that the consequence of all this would be unemployment and inflation, and that it was just a small urban elite in India who were forcing it to turn back on its values of equality that it had held dear since independence. They weren't totally wrong, but it seemed like an earlier era had passed, and reforms continued well into the 2000s. There's a lot of talk about India today as a place of growth, an Asian tiger, a booming, developing economy. The days of double-digit growth that we saw a decade or so back have slowed, but India is still in some ways a boom economy. And in many ways, we can see this historical period as a return to older ideas of India's wealth. Again, that same idea of untapped riches that brought European travelers to India in the first place. But along with growth has come worsening inequality. Life expectancy has risen a lot since independence, from 32.5 years to 65 years, but India's infant mortality rate is still the highest in the world. Half the country's children under the age of 5 are classed as chronically malnourished. The World Bank has declared that a third of the world's poor live in India, and 68% of India's population lives on less than $2 a day. India's agricultural sector is gigantic, but accounts for very little of its GDP. And the UNDP has said that India is 132 out of 187 countries in terms of gender inequality. It's doing very badly. In 1947, Nehru had declared that India's goal was going to be the ending of poverty and ignorance and disease and inequality of opportunity. But I think we can see here that the role that poverty has played in Indian politics has changed very drastically over the last 7 decades. And India is still undecided about how to reconcile those two competing goals of growth on the one hand and equality on the other. When we meet next time, we'll talk about the ways in which another set of fissures played out in post-colonial India, those of caste and religion, as they intersected with politics in the modern world. We've got a lot of ground to cover there too, and I'll look forward to seeing you then.